Welcome to today's performance of From the New World, Dvorak's Ninth Symphony, first movement. My name is John Horzen, and I'm part of an international group of musicians who have been organizing virtual performance ever since the Western world went into quarantine. Our goal has been to provide an online forum for musical community and collaboration during a time when both of those things are, shall we say, not encouraged. We've got a bunch more projects coming up, so if this looks interesting, feel free to check out the link in the description. Now, in the interest of providing a well-rounded classical musical experience, virtual though it may be, we bring you some much-needed context for this piece. Dr. Douglas Shadle is an associate professor of musicology at Vanderbilt University. He's a leading public voice in debates about the role of the symphony orchestra in American life, and he has published extensively on the piece we have prepared for you today. Dr. Shadle, take it away.
Antonin Dvorak's New World Symphony may seem far removed from the racial injustice plaguing American society right now in 2020. But the winter of 1892 into 1893, when he wrote the symphony, was an especially violent season on its own. On February 2nd, 1893, for example, the New York Times ran the following headline: "Another Negro burned. Henry Smith dies at the stake, drawn through the streets on a car, tortured for nearly an hour with hot irons and then burned. Awful vengeance of a Paris, Texas mob." Smith was only one of over 150 Black Americans lynched that year that we know of. Dvorak had come to the United States in September 1892 to be the director of the National Conservatory of Music in New York City. The conservatory's president, Jeanette Thurber, opened the school in 1885 to offer a low-cost education to students from all over the country, and she hoped Dvorak's directorship would allow it to compete on the international stage. In the months prior to Dvorak's arrival, American musicians had been engaged in heated debates about how to construct a specifically American musical style that would distinguish itself from European counterparts. A music theorist from Chicago named A.J. Goodrich expressed one of the more innovative ideas. In July 1892, he wrote, "If our American composers at the present time wish to produce works distinctly American, they must resuscitate the old slave melodies or the Indian ghost dances and make these the motives of their symphonies, suites, and concertos." After Dvorak arrived a few months later, he came to agree with Goodrich. One of the voice students at the conservatory, named Harry T. Burley, sang spirituals in Dvorak's home, and Dvorak studied various published transcriptions of the repertoire. In a highly publicized interview, printed on May 22nd, 1893, Dvorak announced, "I am now satisfied that the future music of this country must be founded upon what are called Negro melodies." Now, given the country's rampant anti-Black racism, white musicians attacked Dvorak on all sides, most notably by denying African Americans authorship of the spiritual repertoire altogether, claiming that white people had actually written this music instead. Harry Smith, editor of the Cleveland Gazette, one of the country's most prominent Black newspapers, wrote in response, "The prediction that the American School of Music is to be built upon what are commonly referred to as Negro melodies seems to be a bitter pill indeed for many prejudiced musicians, white, to swallow. There is no question in our mind but that Dr. Dvorak is on the right track, for the simple reason that about all the truly American music we have is furnished in these very same Negro melodies." Dvorak had essentially finished the symphony by June 1893, but the debate roared for several more months. And in fact, debates about the place of African Americans in the greater cultural landscape continued to rage throughout the summer. Speaking at the Chicago World's Fair, celebrating the 400th year of Columbus's arrival, the great orator Frederick Douglass gave a speech saying, "There is in fact no such problem as the Negro problem. It is called Negro for a purpose. It has substituted Negro for nation, because the one is despised and hated, and the other is loved and honored. The true problem is a national problem. Further, the problem is whether the American people have honesty enough, loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough to live up to their own constitution. The premiere of Dvorak's Symphony a few months later reignited the storm of racism as people disagreed about the extent to which Dvorak had incorporated so-called Negro melodies into the piece in the first place. The first movement that you'll hear contains a clear allusion to Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, one of the songs that Harry Burleigh would later claim was one of Dvorak's favorites. But many people then and now denied that Dvorak had been inspired by the spirituals and claimed that the piece sounded more Czech than American. As discussions about the symphony's national identity raged, racist commentators reiterated that Black Americans hadn't written the spirituals in the first place. Our music theorist A.J. Goodrich replied, though, that the Edict of Lincoln, issued 30 years ago, broke every slave chain and destroyed every auction block in North America. And the plantation melody remains as a memory of that mighty struggle in which the brighter spirits of justice and freedom finally prevailed over oppression and disenfranchisement. A Black school teacher from Washington, D.C., named Walt Hasten, added a few months into this debate, "I believe that posterity humanized, civilized, Christianized above prejudice will be apt to discredit the pretended authorship of Negro melodies. It will have some misgiving in all probability as to the fact that the white American who stole away everything else from the slave actually stopped at his songs and tunes. It will hardly believe that the poor slave, musical, oppressed, sad, alone, should never have poured forth his soul in plaintive airs." Hasten, in other words, believed that white violence against Black American bodies had extended even into the cultural inheritance of music, and that history would eventually document this fact. Richard Greener, the first African-American graduate of Harvard College, later argued that Dvorak was right. "If Dr. Dvorak has any weight," he wrote in September 1894, "Black Americans would become greater than the lawgiver. He is to found the American music of the future." But amid the brutal legal regime of Jim Crow and the rampant extra-legal violence against Black Americans, fulfilling Richard Greener's aim would prove to be a steep obstacle. Dvorak had already tried to do his part by offering free instruction to Black students at the National Conservatory, which the country's socially progressive communities, including African Americans, welcomed. But if his goal was to give voice to Black musicians, what role did the New World Symphony actually play? Describing the symphony, Will Marion Cook, one of his Black students, felt that, as he put it, something lacked. That something which even Dvorak's great genius failed to comprehend, and only a Negro who had seen and felt and suffered could supply. Cook felt that a Black American could do better. Soon, perhaps, Cook wrote in 1898, "will some native composer, hopeful of the future, take the pen and, inspired by long repressed imagination, paint glowing tone pictures of a radiant dawn, a dawn without a passing, a day without a night." My view is that to hear the New World Symphony in 2020 is to hear a crystallization of the racial violence that has defined the American landscape for over 400 years. We hear the voice of an advocate for Black music, and the voice of his student Harry Burleigh, and the anonymous voices of the writers of spirituals. But we should also think about what goes unheard. The voices of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Tony McDade, of Ahmaud Arbery. The countless voices crying out from a night without a dawn. This recording of the first movement is only 45 seconds longer than the 9 minutes George Floyd struggled to breathe.
This performance features the Quarantine Philharmonic, conducted by Jacob Kruzansky. They will perform the first movement of Dvorak's Ninth Symphony, entitled From the New World. This performance is dedicated to George Floyd, his grieving family, and to the promise of racial justice and equality.